My name is Claire, and I'm 31 years old. 5 years ago, my mother called me 3 days before Thanksgiving and said 6 words that shattered everything I thought I knew about family. There just isn't enough room, Claire. I was standing in my small florist shop. The smell of damp eucalyptus and crushed flower stems thick in the air. The shop was quiet, the bell on the door silent for once, leaving only the hum of the refrigeration unit. I had my bags packed in my head, the wool coat, the sensible boots for the muddy driveway, the container of homemade cranberry sauce. I'd spent all night simmering until the berries popped and turned into a deep, ruby glaze. "What do you mean, Mom?" I asked. My hand tightened around my phone. Outside, the November rain turned the pavement into a slick, gray mirror. "Well," she said, her voice light, airy, the way it always got when she was about to do something cruel. "Victoria is bringing her new boyfriend, and his parents are coming too. They're very prestigious, Claire. They're staying in the guest room. And Jessica's kids are getting so big, they need the den for their playroom. We've run out of bedrooms. We thought it might be easier if you just stayed in the city this year. You're so busy with the shop anyway, aren't you?" The silence stretched. In the background, I could hear the familiar clinking of her silver pattern, the heavy, ornate forks she only brought out for the important guests. I could hear my father, David, clearing his throat in the distance. He didn't say a word. He never did. "I could sleep on the couch, Mom," I whispered. My throat felt like it was closing, the bitter smell of some wilting lilies nearby suddenly overwhelming. "I don't mind the couch." "Oh, darling, no," she huffed, a sharp, impatient sound. "That would be so cluttered. It's a formal dinner. It would just make everything feel cramped. You understand, don't you? We'll do a little something together in January. Maybe for coffee? January? 2 months away? Claire, are you there?" I looked down at my hands. They were stained green from the flower sap, the skin raw and chapped from the cold water. I worked 16 hours a day to build something of my own, hoping that if I became successful enough, if I became prestigious enough, I'd finally earn a permanent seat at that table. "I'm here," I said. My voice sounded thin, like a ghost's good. "I knew you'd be the easy one about this. You're always so self-sufficient. Not like Victoria. She needs the support right now with this new relationship. It's a very big deal for her. The easy one? That was my role. I was the load-bearing wall of the family, the one you could lean on, the one you could ignore, the one who didn't need maintenance. I was the sacrifice made so that everyone else could be comfortable." "Right," I said. "The easy one. Wonderful. Have a lovely day, dear. Sell lots of flowers." The line went dead. The dial tone was a flat, mechanical hum that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. I stayed there, standing in the middle of my shop, surrounded by beauty I had created for other people's celebrations. I looked at the bouquet I had been working on. Bright oranges, deep reds, the colors of a warm, inviting hearth. I reached out and touched a petal. It was soft, cold, and entirely indifferent to me. Thought about the years I had spent shrinking myself. I thought about the holidays I'd spent on the kids' table, well into my 20s, because Victoria needed the adult chair. I thought about the time my father forgot my college graduation because my sister had a minor breakup. The same day, I walked over to the front door and flipped the sign from open to closed. The click of the lock felt final. I went to the back room, sat down on a plastic crate, and finally let the first tear fall. It hit my hand, mixing with the green sap and the dirt. I had spent 30 years trying to fit into a house that didn't have a room for me. I had spent 30 years begging for scraps of affection, while my sisters were given the feast. I looked at the container of cranberry sauce sitting on my workbench. It was still warm. I had made it with so much love, so much hope. I picked it up and walked to the trash can. As the ruby red sauce slid out and hit the bottom of the bin with a heavy, wet thud, something inside me went quiet. Not sad, not angry, just empty. It was the sound of a heart, finally stopping its frantic knocking on a door that was never going to open. Wasn't going to January coffee? I wasn't going to be the easy one anymore. But as the darkness of the early winter evening settled into the shop, something else settled too, a quiet decision. I didn't even fully understand yet. If there was no room for me at their table, I would have to stop being hungry for their bread. The empty silence of the shop was a physical weight. I sat on that plastic crate until my legs went numb, watching the streetlights flicker on outside. It's funny how a single phone call can rewrite your entire history. Suddenly, I wasn't just looking at one missed Thanksgiving. I was looking at a lifetime of being the extra. I closed my eyes and I was 8 years old again. It was my birthday, late October. The air smelling of wood smoke and damp leaves. I had asked for a small party, just a few friends from school and a chocolate cake. I remember wearing my favorite velvet dress, the fabric soft against my skin. I waited by the window for the first car to pull into the driveway, but the house was frantic for a different reason. Victoria had been chosen for the lead in the school play, and the costume fitting was that afternoon. "We'll be back in an hour," Claire, my mother Linda, had said, checking her reflection in the hallway mirror. She didn't look at me. She was busy smoothing Victoria's hair. "There's juice in the fridge. If your friends show up, just tell them we're on our way." I watched them pile into the car. My father, Robert, caught my eye through the glass. He looked like he wanted to say something. His mouth opened, a small crease forming between his brows, but Mom tapped the dashboard, and he shifted the car into reverse. He chose the path of least resistance. He always did. I sat on the porch steps for 3 hours. 2 friends showed up, stayed for 20 minutes, and left when their parents realized no adults were home. By the time my family returned, the sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the lawn. "Oh, are they gone?" Mom asked, stepping over me with grocery bags full of shimmering fabric for the costume. "Well, at least you had some quiet time. You've always been so good at playing by yourself. No cake. No happy birthday." Just the realization that my milestones were merely obstacles in the way of Victoria's spotlight. I stood up from the crate in the back of my flower shop, my knees cracking. I walked to the small mirror tucked behind the workstation. My face looked different in the fluorescent light, older, tired, but there was a sharpness in my eyes I hadn't seen before. Thought about every holiday, every golden child moment I had cheered for while my own achievements were treated like footnotes. When I opened this shop, my mother hadn't even come to the ribbon cutting. "It's just so far, Claire. And Jessica has that soccer tournament," she'd said. Jessica, the middle sister, was the peacekeeper who stayed in Mom's good graces by never rocking the boat. I picked up my shears. They were heavy, professional-grade steel. I began to vent my grief on a bucket of unsold roses, snipping the heads off with brutal, rhythmic precision, snip for the time they forgot to pick me up from work in the rain, snip for the Christmas. I got a gift card while Victoria got a trip to Europe, snip for the way my father looked at the floor whenever Mom sharpened her tongue against me. Realized then that it wasn't just that they didn't have room for me at the table. It was that they had spent decades convincing me I didn't deserve a seat in the first place. They had groomed me to be the person who expected nothing. So they never had to give anything. The grief was a cold, bitter taste in the back of my throat like a burnt coffee bean. It wasn't the kind of sadness that makes you wail. It was the kind that makes you go still. The kind that turns your heart into a fortress. I pulled out my phone again. I didn't call my mother. I didn't text my sisters to complain. Instead, I scrolled through my contacts. Most were wholesalers or regular customers. Then I saw a name I hadn't thought of in months. I didn't call her either. Not yet. I walked to the front of the shop and looked at the display window. I had spent so much time making things look perfect for everyone else's lives. I looked at the easy one in the reflection. "No more," I whispered. The sound of my own voice startled me. It was firm. I went to my apartment that night and sat in the dark. The silence wasn't lonely, it was honest. My father had a chance to choose me 1,000 times over the last 30 years. He had 1,000 chances to say, "No, Linda, Claire is coming home." And every single time, he chose silence instead. Realize that night that you can't force people to love you by being convenient. You can't earn a place in a heart that is already closed. I sat in my apartment as the sun went down, watching the shadows stretch across my floor, finally understanding that the house I grew up in wasn't a home. It was a cage I had been polishing from the inside. The morning of Thanksgiving arrived with a cruel, mocking brightness. The sun hit the frost on my apartment windows, turning the glass into a jagged map of ice. Usually I'd be 3 hours into a drive by now, nursing a lukewarm thermos of coffee and bracing myself for the subtle jabs about my little flower hobby or why I wasn't married yet, but today, the only sound was the hum of my refrigerator and the distant, muffled barking of a neighbor's dog. I tried to stay in bed, pulling the duvet over my head to drown out the day. But the smell of the city, damp concrete and cold air, seeped in. By noon, the silence in the apartment felt less like peace and more like a vacuum, sucking the air out of my lungs. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. I saw the heavy oak table draped in the lace cloth that had belonged to my grandmother. I saw the steam rising from the turkey, the golden light of the candles, and the empty chair that wasn't actually empty because Victoria's boyfriend's father was sitting in it. He was sitting in my spot. He was using my grandmother's silver. My stomach growled. A sharp physical reminder of my own existence. I hadn't eaten since yesterday. I walked to the kitchen and opened the fridge. It was a wasteland. A carton of almond milk, a half-used jar of pesto, and a single withered lemon. I thought about the cranberry sauce in the trash bin at the shop. I thought about the January coffee. Fine, I whispered, my voice cracking in the empty room. If I'm alone, I'm alone. But I'm not starving. I put on my thickest sweater, the one that smelled faintly of the lavender sachets I kept in my drawer, and wrapped a scarf twice around my neck. I needed movement. I needed a crowd of people who didn't know I was the unwanted daughter. Outside, the city was eerie. It was that specific kind of holiday quiet where the streets feel private, as if the buildings are leaning in to whisper to each other. I walked for blocks, my boots clicking rhythmically on the pavement. I passed darkened windows and closed shop doors. Occasionally, the smell of roasted poultry would waft from an upper-story vent, and I'd have to swallow hard against the lump in my throat. I found myself in a neighborhood I didn't visit often, a place of old brick brownstones and wrought iron fences. My toes were frozen, and the tip of my nose felt like a piece of ice. I was looking for a diner, a dive bar, anything with a "We're open" sign. Then I saw it. The Hearth. It was a small corner restaurant with amber light spilling out onto the sidewalk. A chalkboard sign stood out front, decorated with hand-drawn pumpkins. No one eats alone today. Fixed menu. Open doors. I hesitated at the handle. My hands were trembling, not just from the cold, but from the sheer vulnerability of being a woman, alone on a day meant for belonging. He looked to be about my age, maybe a few years older, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold a permanent spark of humor. He wore an apron over a navy sweater, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms dusted with flour. This was Daniel. He didn't look at me with pity. He didn't look at me like a problem to be solved. Yes, I said, clutching my coat to my chest. Just me. Then you're just in time, he said, pulling a menu from the podium. We have one spot left at the communal table. It's the best seat in the house. If you like stories and don't mind passing the gravy. I followed him through the maze of tables. The noise was a symphony, the clatter of porcelain, the rhythmic thump-thump of a knife in the kitchen, the deep belly laugh of a man in the corner. For the first time in days, the coldness in my chest began to thaw, just a fraction. He pulled out a chair between an elderly woman with pearls and a younger couple who looked like they were traveling. I'm Daniel, he said, leaning in slightly so I could hear him over the din. If you need anything, more wine, a distraction, or a second helping of pie, just wave me down. I'm Claire, I managed to say. Welcome home, Claire, he said. It was a simple phrase tossed off casually, but it hit me like a blow to the solar plexus. I sat down. The wood of the table was warm under my palms. I looked at the strangers around me, all of us untethered from our origins for one reason or another. I grabbed my coat and tucked it behind me. If I was going to eat Thanksgiving dinner alone, I was going to do it here, in this pocket of golden light. Picked up the water carafe and poured a glass for the elderly woman next to me. She smiled, her eyes crinkling into 1,000 tiny lines of history. Thank you, dear, she said. I'm Eleanor. Is this your first time at the hearth? It is, I said. I took a sip of water. It was crisp and cold. For the first time in my life, no one was asking me to move so someone else could sit down. No one was telling me I was the easy one. I was just Claire. I grabbed my fork. I was going to eat. I was going to survive this day. I just had to keep breathing in the scent of the sage and the warmth of the room. I looked through the glass. It was packed. Steam fogged the upper panes. I saw people in flannel shirts, a woman in a fancy silk dress, and an old man in a veteran's cap. I pushed the door open. A bell chimed, a bright, silver sound that cut through the low roar of conversation. The heat hit me first, smelling of sage, roasted garlic, and something sweet, like bubbling apples. It was a physical embrace. Just one? A man stood before me. The meal at the hearth wasn't just food. It was an awakening. Plate after plate arrived, turkey so tender it fell apart at the touch of a fork, stuffing seasoned with heavy hits of rosemary and thyme, and mashed potatoes that tasted like pure, unadulterated comfort, but it was the conversation that filled the hollow spaces in my chest. Eleanor, the woman beside me, didn't ask what I did for a living or why I wasn't with my real family. Instead, she talked about the jazz clubs she used to frequent in the 60s and the way the city looked before the skyscrapers took over the horizon. Across from us, Daniel, who I realized wasn't just a waiter, but the owner, would stop by every 20 minutes not just to refill water, but to drop a joke or a thoughtful question that wove the table. Together, you have a designer's eye, Daniel said, pausing by my chair as I rearranged the small sprig of dried bittersweet he'd placed by each setting. The way you're looking at the composition of that centerpiece, you're a creative. I'm a florist, I said, feeling a flush of warmth that had nothing to do with the wine. I have a small shop a few miles from here. A florist, he mused, his eyes crinkling. Then you know that everything has its season. Even the things that look like they're dying are just preparing for something else. He caught my gaze for a second. Too long, a moment of true witness, before someone called his name from the kitchen. I watched him go, his movements steady and protective of the space he'd built. As the evening wound down, the younger couple left, and the restaurant began to quiet. The smell of pumpkin spice and burnt sugar from the pies lingered in the air. Eleanor leaned closer to me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. Her skin was like parchment, but her grip was surprisingly firm. "You have a heavy heart today, Claire," she whispered. "I can see it in the way you hold your shoulders. Like you're waiting for someone to tell you to leave." I felt the prickle of tears behind my eyes. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to those of us who have spent years feeling the same way," she said. "But look around. This table? This isn't an accident. Daniel built this place for people who needed a different kind of map. He's my nephew, you know, or he's the son of my heart, at least. We aren't blood, but we're family." I looked at her, confused. "He's not your biological nephew?" "No," she smiled, a secret, beautiful expression. "I was his landlord 10 years ago, when he was a broke chef with a big dream and a broken spirit. His own parents. Well, they didn't see the value in a son who wanted to feed people's souls instead of their bank accounts. So we made our own contract. I gave him a kitchen, and he gave me a reason to wake up every morning." Just then, a tall, sturdy man with a silver beard and a quiet, watchful presence walked out from the back, carrying a stack of clean linens. He stopped by Eleanor and kissed the top of her head. "Ready to go, Ellie?" "Richard is waiting in the car," the man said. "Claire." "This is Thomas," Eleanor said, introducing the man. "He's the one who keeps the lights on and the pipes from freezing. My husband, Richard, and I, well, we've adopted a whole brood of misfits over the years." Thomas was the first. Thomas gave me a nod, steady, quietly protective, the kind of look that makes you feel like the floor beneath you is finally solid. "Nice to meet you, Claire. If you're a friend of Ellie's, you're welcome here anytime. Not just on holidays. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being evaluated. I wasn't being compared to Victoria's prestige or Jessica's peacekeeping. I was just a person sitting at a table with people who saw me clearly." "I should go," I said, though every fiber of my being wanted to stay in that golden light. "I don't want to overstay." "You can't overstay when you're already home," Daniel said, appearing behind Thomas. He handed me a small paper bag, the bottom warm from a fresh loaf of bread. "Take this. For breakfast tomorrow." "And Claire?" "Yes? We're doing a winter solstice dinner in a few weeks. No invitation needed. Just show up." I walked out into the cold November night, the bag of bread tucked under my arm like a treasure. The rain had stopped, and the stars were beginning to peek through the city haze. My heart was still bruised, yes. The wound of my mother's rejection was still raw and pulsing. But as I walked toward the subway, I didn't feel like a ghost anymore. I felt like a seed that had finally been dropped into good soil. I didn't know these people, not really, but for the first time, I had seen what love looked like. When it wasn't a transaction, I got back to my apartment, and for the first time in years, I didn't check my phone to see if my mother had called to apologize. I didn't check my sister's social media to see photos of the prestigious dinner guests. I just set the bread on the counter, breathed in the scent of yeast and warmth, and realized that the easy one was finally going to start doing what was hard, choosing herself. The following weeks were a blur of morning mist and the scent of winter pine. Business at the flower shop picked up as the solstice approached, but for the first time, the grueling hours didn't feel like a penance. I wasn't working to prove I existed. I was working to fund a new life. Found myself returning to the hearth on Tuesday nights, the slowest evening for the restaurant. I'd bring small arrangements, leftover ranunculus, sprigs of silverleaf eucalyptus, or deep burgundy hellebores, and set them on the bar. For the atmosphere, I'd tell Daniel, trying to keep my voice casual. For the soul, he'd correct me, sliding a cup of coffee across the wood. It was never just coffee. It was a ritual. He'd tell me about a new spice he'd discovered. And I'd tell him about the way a specific rose opens up only when it's handled with warmth. One evening, Eleanor was there, sitting in her usual corner with a stack of books. She beckoned me over. Sit, Claire. You've been on your feet since dawn. I can smell the cedar on your sweater. I sat, and within minutes, the chosen family began to gravitate toward the table. Thomas came by with a plate of short ribs that had been braising for 12 hours, their rich, savory scent grounding me. Then Richard, Eleanor's husband, joined us. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was like a gavel striking. He had been a public defender for 40 years, and he looked at the world with a weary kind of grace. Daniel tells me your shop is tucked away on 4th. Richard said, his voice a low rumble. That's a tough block for foot traffic. You must be good at what you do to keep the doors open. I try, I said, twisting a napkin in my lap. My mother always said it was a hobby. A pretty little distraction until I settled down. The table went quiet. Not the awkward quiet of my family's dinner table, where everyone looked away to avoid a fight, but a heavy communal silence of shared understanding. People who don't build anything are usually the first to criticize the architecture of others, Eleanor said softly. She reached across the table and took my hand. Her touch was warm, smelling faintly of vanilla and old paper. You aren't a distraction, Claire. You're a creator. And in this family, we protect the creators. Over the next month, I was slowly, meticulously woven into their tapestry. It wasn't a sudden explosion of belonging. It was a series of small, steady stitches. It was Thomas showing up at my shop on a Tuesday morning with a toolbox, silently fixing the leaky faucet I'd been ignoring for months. It was Richard calling me to ask if I had a professional opinion on the winter garden he was trying to plant, making me feel like an expert instead of an amateur. It was Daniel. Daniel, who began to close the restaurant early on Sundays so he could walk me home. We'd walk through the biting city wind, our shoulders occasionally brushing. He didn't rush the silence. He let it sit between us like a comfortable blanket. Why do you do it? I asked him one night as we stood outside my apartment building. The snow was starting to fall in fat, lazy flakes, dusting his dark hair. The communal table. The open doors. You give so much of yourself away. He leaned against the brickwork, looking out at the empty street. I grew up in a house where love was a ledger, he said. Every kindness had a price tag. Every hug was an investment. When I left, I promised myself I'd build a place where the currency was just being there, where you didn't have to earn your keep. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. You spend so much time making sure everyone else has beauty, Claire. I just want to make sure you have some too. I felt a flutter in my chest, a terrifying, wonderful spark of hope. For 30 years, I had been the girl who was easy to overlook. But in the glow of the street lamp, under the watchful eyes of Eleanor and Richard and Thomas, I was becoming someone else. I was becoming a woman who was seen, but the past has a way of clawing at the heels of the future, just as I was beginning to believe in this new warmth. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A text from my mother. Claire, Victoria's engagement party is the 20th. We need you to do the centerpieces. Nothing too expensive, obviously, but make them look high-end. We'll need about 20. I'll send you the color palette. Don't be late this time. No, how are you? No, sorry about Thanksgiving. Just an order for 20 centerpieces for the sister who sat in my chair. I looked at the phone, then at Daniel, who was watching the snow. The old Claire would have replied immediately, apologizing for the imaginary lateness, calculating how much the flowers would cost her out of pocket. Just to please a mother who didn't even like her, I looked at my hands, stained. Scarred and strong, everything okay? Daniel asked, sensing the shift in my energy. Yeah, I said, slipping the phone back into my pocket without replying. Everything is finally starting to be okay. But as I climbed the stairs to my apartment, the fear remained. It's one thing to find a new family. It's another thing entirely to tell the old one that they no longer hold the keys to your heart. Trust was a fragile blossom, and mine was just starting to bud. By the time the winter solstice arrived, the air in the city felt different, sharper, yet filled with a strange electric clarity. The hearth was draped in evergreen boughs, the scent of crushed pine needles mixing with the deep, caramelized aroma of roasting pears I hadn't replied to my mother's text about the engagement party. I had left it sitting there, a digital ghost in my pocket. Every time I thought about the 20 centerpieces she demanded, I felt a phantom ache in my lower back. The memory of years spent working myself to the bone for a thank you, that never came. That evening, the solstice dinner wasn't just a meal. It was a sanctuary. Daniel had outdone himself. The tables were pushed together to form one long, winding river of wood and candlelight. I had spent the afternoon creating a living runner for the center, mosses, white anemones with their dark, ink-blot centers, and twisted willow branches that looked like a forest in miniature. "It's breathtaking." "Claire," Daniel whispered, coming up behind me as I tucked a final sprig of boxwood into place. He placed a hand on the small of my back, a light, steady warmth that made my breath hitch. "You've turned my dining room into a cathedral." "It already was one," I said. Turning to face him, the restaurant was filling up. Eleanor and Richard were at the head of the table, presiding over their chaotic, beautiful collection of misfits with a quiet pride. Thomas was laughing, a rare, booming sound as he poured wine for a young musician, who had started playing at the restaurant on weekends. As we sat down, the room hummed with a frequency I had never felt at my biological family's table. There was no undercurrent of competition. No one was waiting for a lull in conversation to point out a flaw or a failure. Toward the end of the night, after the plates had been cleared, and only the dregs of the red wine remained in the glasses, Daniel stood up. He tapped his glass, and the room fell into a respectful hush. "Most people think the solstice is about the darkness," he said, his eyes finding mine across the flickering candles. "But it's actually about the turning point. It's the moment we acknowledge the cold, yes, but we celebrate the fact that from this second on, the light is coming back. It's a day for choosing what we carry forward." He raised his glass. "To the family we find, to the people who see us when we're invisible, and to Claire, who brought the spring back into this room tonight. To Claire." The table echoed. I felt a heat rise in my cheeks. But for once, I didn't want to shrink. I didn't want to disappear. I looked at Eleanor, who blew me a kiss, and at Thomas, who raised his glass with a wink. Later, after the guests had trickled out into the snowy night, Daniel and I stayed behind to blow out the candles. The room was cast in a soft blue-gray light. "I have something for you," Daniel said. He reached into his apron pocket and pulled out a small, heavy envelope. "It's not a gift exactly. It's a proposal. But not the kind you think." I opened the envelope. Inside was a key and a legal document, a lease for the vacant storefront, right next to the hearth. "The landlord is a friend of Richard's," Daniel said, stepping closer. "He's been looking for a tenant who would treat the space with soul. I told him I knew a florist who was tired of being tucked away on a dark block. I told him she deserved a window that caught the morning sun." I looked at the key, then at the man who had seen a version of me I hadn't even met yet. "Daniel, I can't. The cost. We'll figure it out," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register. He took my hand, his thumb tracing the scars on my knuckles. "You've spent your whole life being a backup plan, Claire. It's time you were the main event. You're safe here. We aren't going to let you fall." In that moment, under the dying embers of the solstice candles, he leaned in. The kiss tasted like winter and hope, cool, fresh, and deeply transformative. It wasn't the frantic, uncertain heat of my past relationships. It was a slow, deliberate choosing. But as I walked home that night, the weight of the key in my pocket felt like both a promise and a threat. To take this step meant fully severing the tether to the people who shared my DNA, but not my heart. The next morning, my phone rang. It wasn't a text this time. It was my mother. "Claire," she snapped as soon as I answered. "I haven't heard back about the engagement party. I assume you're already sourcing the lilies? Victoria wants the premium ones, the ones with the scent. And don't forget the delivery to the country club. We need them set up by 10 a.m. sharp." I looked at the new key sitting on my nightstand, gleaming in the morning light. I thought about Daniel's kiss and Eleanor's warm hand on mine. "No," I said. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. "Excuse me?" my mother whispered, her voice like a sharpening blade. "I won't be doing the flowers, Mom, and I won't be at the party. I have a new shop to set up. I'm busy building a life where I'm not the easy one. You are being incredibly selfish, Claire. After everything we've done for you, you didn't even have a bed for me. At Thanksgiving," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. You told me there wasn't enough room, so I found a room of my own. Don't call me again unless you're ready to apologize. I hung up. My hands were shaking, but the air in my apartment felt cleaner than it ever had. I had stood my ground. But as the day wore on, a new fear began to settle. My mother wasn't a woman who took no for an answer. She wouldn't just let me go. She would try to burn the bridge while I was still standing on it. The next 2 years were a whirlwind of soil, silk ribbons, and the steady, rhythmic pulse of a life built on purpose. My new shop, the Wild Hearth, flourished. With the morning sun finally hitting my windows, the flowers seemed to bloom with a different kind of defiance. But it wasn't just the business that was growing. It was the roots I had planted with Eleanor, Richard, and Daniel. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, we were all gathered in the back of the restaurant. The air smelled of damp earth and Richard's cherry pipe tobacco. Eleanor sat across from me, a legal folder resting on her lap. She looked at me with an intensity that made the breath catch in my throat. Claire, she began, her voice soft but unwavering. Richard and I have spent our lives advocating for people the world discarded. We've built a legacy of choice. But as we get older, we realize that the most important thing we have isn't our property or our bank accounts. It's our name. And we want to share it with you. Richard cleared his throat, leaning forward. We'd like to make this official, Claire. An adult adoption. We want you to be ours in every way the law allows. Not because you need parents. You're a formidable woman on your own. But because we want the world to know that you are never, ever going to be unclaimed again. I sat there, my hands covered in the dust of some dried pampas grass. I looked at Daniel, who was leaning against the doorframe, a proud, knowing smile on his face. This wasn't just a gesture. It was a permanent fortress. It was the room I had been told didn't exist. Yes, I whispered, the word feeling like a prayer. More than anything, the paperwork was filed and the hearing was set for the following month. We decided to combine the celebration of the adoption with my and Daniel's wedding. It was going to be a small, intimate affair at the restaurant, the place where the shattering had turned into a mosaic. But as the date approached, the old shadows began to lengthen. I was at the shop, finishing a bridal bouquet of white anemones and cascading ivy, when the bell chimed. I didn't even have to look up to feel the temperature in the room drop. The scent of expensive, heavy perfume, the kind my mother wore to prestige events, cut through the sweetness of the roses. So, it's true, Linda said, her voice dripping with a forced, brittle pity. You've actually gone through with this charade. I looked up. She was standing there in a tailored wool coat, looking around my shop as if the flowers were common weeds. Behind her stood Victoria, looking bored and tapping at her phone. Mom, I said, my voice surprised by its own calm. What are you doing here? I received a very confusing notification from the county clerk's office, Claire. Something about a name change and a legal proceeding? I thought it was a mistake. A clerical error. She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. You're replacing us? Your own flesh and blood? With a landlord and a retired lawyer? I'm not replacing anyone, I said, setting the bouquet down. I'm just making the space official. The space you told me you didn't have. Don't be dramatic, Victoria sighed, finally looking up. Mom was stressed that year. You're always so sensitive, but this is an embarrassment to the family. People are asking questions, Claire. Do you have any idea how this looks for my husband's partners? That my sister is being adopted like a stray dog at 33? It looks like a woman being chosen, I replied. Something you wouldn't understand because you've never had to wonder if there was a seat for you. We're here to give you one last chance, Linda said, her face hardening. Drop this legal nonsense. Come home for the weekend. We'll have a dinner. We'll invite the neighbors. We'll show everyone that we're a united front. You'll do the flowers for Victoria's charity gala, and we'll put this little rebellion behind us. I looked at my mother, the woman who had spent 30 years using silence as a weapon and guilt as a leash. For the first time, she looked small. She didn't look like a giant. She looked like a person terrified of losing. Her power over the one person she could always count on to shrink. The wedding is in 3 weeks, I said, and the adoption hearing is the morning of. You aren't invited to either. You wouldn't dare, Linda hissed. Without us, you are nothing. You have no history. You have no roots. I have better than roots, I said, stepping around the counter. I have a family that actually likes me. Now please leave. I have a wedding bouquet to finish for a bride who actually wants to be here. As they walked out, the bell chimed one last time, a sharp, metallic sound. My heart was thundering, a cold sweat breaking out across my neck. I knew they wouldn't go quietly. My mother thrived on the united front, and my public rejection was a crack in her perfect porcelain life. Looked at the white anemones. They were fragile, but their stems were strong. I was terrified of what they would do next. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't alone in the fight. I had a father who would stand in the gap, a mother who would hold the line, and a man who loved me not for my convenience, but for my soul. The morning of the wedding, the air smelled like rain and wood smoke. We stood in the judge's chambers, Eleanor, Richard, Daniel, and I. The legal proceeding was short, almost clinical, but when the judge signed the final decree and looked up, he smiled. "Congratulations, Claire. It's not often I get to witness a family being built by choice. It's a powerful thing." Richard pulled me into a hug, his wool coat smelling of cedar and the outdoors. "Official," he whispered. "You're ours, Claire, permanently." The reception at the hearth was supposed to be our sanctuary. I had spent the morning transforming the dining room into a dream of winter whites and deep greens. We had only been celebrating for an hour, the sound of laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses filling the room. When the front door swung open with a violent, jarring thud, the music didn't stop. But the room went cold. My biological family marched in like a small, angry army. My mother was in the lead, dressed in a sharp, blood-red suit that screamed for attention. Behind her, my father, Robert, looked at his shoes, his shoulders hunched in his usual practiced cowardice. Victoria and Jessica followed, looking around the warm, rustic restaurant with visible disdain. "Well," Linda announced, her voice cutting through the intimate atmosphere like a serrated blade, "I see the stray dog has found a kennel." Daniel stepped forward immediately, his hand instinctively finding the small of my back. But I put a hand on his chest. I needed to do this. I needed to be the one who stood tall. "Mom," I said, my voice surprisingly level, "I told you that you weren't invited. And I told you that we are a family," she snapped, stepping toward the communal table. She looked at Eleanor, who was sitting calmly with a glass of wine. "And you? You think you can just sign a piece of paper and steal a daughter? You have no right to be here. This is a private family matter." Richard stood up then. He didn't raise his voice, but the courtroom authority he had carried for 40 years filled the room. "Actually, Linda, I'm a retired officer of the court, and I can assure you that everything here is private, legal, and none of your business. You are trespassing." "Trespassing?" Victoria laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "We're her sisters. We're the ones who grew up with her while she was being too sensitive and difficult. You people are just a phase. You're the January coffee people." I looked at my father. He finally looked up, his eyes watery and tired. "Claire, honey," he said, his voice trembling. "Just come outside. Let's talk. Your mother is just hurt. We don't want a scene." "No, Dad," I said, stepping toward him. "You don't want a scene. You never do. You've spent 30 years watching her starve me of affection, watching her push me out of the house, watching her tell me there wasn't enough room. And you stayed silent to keep your own life easy. Your silence was a choice. And today, I'm choosing a different kind of father." I turned to my mother. She was shaking now, her face mottled with rage. "You're making a mistake, Claire. These people don't know you. They don't know your flaws. They'll get tired of you just like everyone else does." "They do know my flaws," I said. And for the first time, I felt a strange sense of pity for her. The difference is they don't use them as leverage. They don't make me earn my seat at the table. They just give it to me. "Leave," I said, and this time the word was a command. You weren't there when I was alone on Thanksgiving. You weren't there when I built my business. You aren't here now. You're just ghosts of a life I've outgrown." Thomas and Daniel moved toward the door, their presence a silent, immovable wall. "Fine," Linda spat, clutching her designer bag to her chest. "Keep your little restaurant family, but don't you dare come crying to us when this fantasy falls apart. You're dead to us, Claire." "Mom," I called out as she reached the door. She paused, hope flickering in her eyes for one final second of control. "The difference is I've been dead to you for years. I'm finally alive to me." The door closed. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was a vacuum being filled with fresh air. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Richard. He didn't say a word, just squeezed my arm and handed me a fresh glass of champagne. Daniel took my other hand, lacing his fingers through mine, his thumb grazing my wedding ring. I looked around the room, at Eleanor, at Thomas, at the friends and neighbors who had become my pillars. The biological tether was gone. The bridge was burnt. But as the music started up again, a soft, hopeful acoustic melody, I realized I wasn't falling. I was standing on the most solid ground I had ever known. I wasn't the easy one anymore. I was a daughter, a wife, and a woman who had finally found exactly where she belonged. The weeks following the wedding felt like the first deep breath after a long underwater swim. The silence from my biological family wasn't a void. It was a gift. For the first time in my life, my phone didn't represent a potential landmine. I stopped flinching when a notification popped up. I stopped rehearsing apologies for things I hadn't done. 6 months into my new life, a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived at the shop. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. My mother's elegant, aggressive script. I sat at my workbench, surrounded by the scent of peonies and damp moss, and opened it. It wasn't an apology. It was a list of grievances and a bill for expenses incurred during my upbringing, followed by a bitter letter from Victoria blaming me for her husband's family distancing themselves after the wedding scene. Read it once. I felt the old familiar sting for exactly 3 seconds. And then I did something the old Claire could never have imagined. I walked over to my industrial paper shredder and watched the pages turn into harmless white confetti. I didn't reply. I didn't defend myself. I didn't let their poison into my bloodstream. Instead, I sat down and wrote my own letters. I wrote to Eleanor and Richard, trying to put into words what it felt like to be 33, years old, and finally feel like someone's priority. I wrote to Daniel, leaving the note in the pocket of his favorite flower-dusted apron, thanking him for being the first person to ever choose me first. Healing, I realized, wasn't a destination. It was a slow, deliberate gardening of the soul. By the time the first anniversary of this shattering Thanksgiving rolled around, the world looked entirely different. The wild hearth was thriving, but the real growth was happening within the walls of our home. One evening, as Daniel and I were closing up the restaurant, the air smelling of roasted garlic and the last of the autumn cider, I felt a familiar, gentle flutter in my stomach. It wasn't anxiety this time. It was life. "Daniel," I whispered, leaning against the communal table, the very spot where I had sat as a stranger a year ago. He looked up from the ledger, his eyes softening the moment they met mine. "Yeah, Claire? We're going to need another chair," I said, my voice thick with a joy so sharp it almost hurt. "A small one? For next year." The way he dropped the pen, the way he crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled me into a hug that smelled of safety and home is a memory I've tucked away in the softest part of my heart. That night, we walked over to Eleanor and Richard's house. They were sitting on the porch, a blanket over their knees, watching the first few flakes of a pre-winter snow drift down toward the pavement. When we told them, Eleanor didn't just congratulate us. She wept. She held my face in her hands, her skin smelling of vanilla, and whispered, "She will never have to wonder if there's room, Claire. We'll build the whole house around her." I realized then that the cycle was broken. The legacy of being the acceptable sacrifice ended with me. My child would never know the coldness of a prestigious dinner where love was measured in square footage and social standing. They would grow up in the warmth of the hearth, surrounded by a family that was tied together not by the accident of DNA, but by the deliberate daily choice to show up. The letters from the past were gone. The echoes of not enough room had been drowned out by the sound of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the steady beat of a heart that was finally, unequivocally, home. I stood in the center of the new shop today, my hand resting on the slight curve of my stomach. The light was golden, catching the dust motes dancing between the hanging dried hydrangeas and the fresh eucalyptus. It's been 5 years since that phone call. 5 years since I was told there wasn't enough room. Look at the wall behind my counter. It isn't covered in awards or prestigious accolades. Instead, it's covered in photos. There's one of Richard walking me down the aisle, his eyes fierce with pride. There's one of Eleanor holding my daughter, Grace, named for the grace I was given when I least expected it. And there's one of the communal table at the restaurant, packed with people who have no biological business being together, yet belong to each other more than I ever belonged to the people who shared my name. My daughter will grow up in this light. She will never know the feeling of being the easy one, because she will never be asked to make herself small. She will grow up knowing that a table is only as good as the welcome it extends to the weary. The healing didn't happen overnight. Some days I still catch the scent of that expensive perfume in a crowd, and my heart skips a beat in fear. But then I remember, I am not that girl anymore. I am not the girl waiting on the porch for a car that isn't coming. I am the woman who built the porch. V learned that the greatest act of rebellion against a family that doesn't want you is to be happy without them, chosen, to thrive, to build a legacy of warmth where they left a trail of cold. I didn't just survive the shattering. I used the pieces to build a mosaic that is far more beautiful than the original vessel could ever have been. CTA section. If you're watching this and you've been the scapegoat of your family, if you've been told you're too much or too sensitive or always causing drama just because you dared to ask to be treated fairly, I want you to know something. It's not you. It never was. You deserve to be chosen. Not as a backup, not as a last resort, not as the acceptable sacrifice when someone else's comfort is at stake. Chosen first. Chosen fully. Chosen without conditions. Family isn't blood. Family isn't obligation. Family isn't people who share your DNA but treat you like a burden. Family is the people who show up. The people who see you crying alone and invite you to their table. The people who open their hearts and their homes and make you officially, permanently, undeniably theirs. I spent 30 years trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it. And then I spent 5 years learning what love actually looks like. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. It helps more people find these stories when they need them most. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to set boundaries with your own family? Share your experience in the comments. I read every single one. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing how far this story reaches. And if you want more stories like this, check the description. I've linked some of my favorites there. Until next time, remember, you deserve to be